Good morning, everyone. Good evening, good night, or whatever daytime you're having at the moment. I hope you're all doing great and ready to level up your English today. Welcome back to Takeaway English class. Here's your teacher, Mary. How's everyone doing today? Oh, hello there. Good morning. How's everyone doing today? Thank you guys for the likes. If you're just joining, hi there. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Welcome to Takeaway English class. Here's your teacher, Mary. Good morning. Welcome guys. Welcome to Takeaway English class. Here's your teacher, Mary. I hope you're all doing great and ready to level up your English today. Let's just give a minute for more people to join and then we can start our today's lesson. Let me know if you can hear me clearly and see everything properly. Okay? And of course, don't forget to tap the screen. It helps bring more people into the live. And the more people join us, the longer we'll stay live. And of course, it shows me your support and lets me know you're enjoying being here with me. Okay, shall we get started? I'm sure more people will join us as we go. So, we're learning relative clauses, right? Relative clauses. This is my brand new book where I explain everything about relative clauses. I explain the grammar behind relative clauses. Because if you attended my previous classes on the grammar behind phrasal verbs, you already know that I like to go deeper when it comes to grammar. I don't just make my students memorize complicated grammar terms. I like to use visual ideas. and explain things step by step, so you can understand the logic behind grammar. That's why I've written this book that explains everything about relative clauses in a simple way. It starts from the basics, like what a noun is, what a relative pronoun is, relative adverbs, because we need nouns, relative pronouns, relative adverbs to build relative clauses. So this book takes you step by step from beginner to intermediate level, like from A2 level of English to B1, B2. It also includes lots of exercises with answers, so you can practice and check your progress, and much more. Okay? So, during my previous live lessons, we talked about relative clauses as an idea and about their importance. We also learned some of the relative words, such as who, whose, that, which, whom, where, when, why, right? We talked about nouns as well. Different categories of nouns and their roles in a sentence. So these small details help us build relative clauses correctly. Now, today I want to draw your attention to the two different types of relative clauses. Two different types of relative clauses. The two main types of relative clauses. Okay? Because yes, we know what a relative clause is, but it's important to understand the different types of relative clauses and the difference between them. So, there are two types of relative clauses, two main types of relative clauses. Defining relative clause and non-defining relative clause. Now let's go back to the idea of a passport. Okay? So, think of the defining relative clause as a passport. Now, imagine you're at the airport. Which of the following documents are essential? A passport, or a resume, or driving license, or maybe bachelor's degree, or birth certificate. Which one of them is important if you are at the airport? Which one of them? The passport is essential, right? So it's like a defining relative clause. It identifies the person. Without it, we cannot be identified. That's exactly what a defining relative clause does. So the type of relative clause that works like a passport is a defining relative clause. Why? Because a defining relative clause gives essential information. Without this information, we cannot identify the person or thing. We cannot identify someone or something. So, defining relative clause works like a passport. Defining relative clause helps us identify someone or something. It provides essential information. Okay? So it helps us to make clear to the listener to understand which person we mean or which thing we mean. Okay? Okay, examples. Defining relative clause, okay? Defining. Let's say you are watching a football game. There are okay, let's say this is a so imagine you're watching a football game. There are lots of players and you're watching from outside with your friend. And you say, the boy is my friend. The boy is my friend. Can your friend understand which boy, which player you mean? The boy is my friend. No, right? The listener can't understand, won't understand which boy you mean. So we need a passport here. Essential information to identify which boy we mean. Without this information, the listener won't understand which boy you mean. That's where we need defining relative clause, a passport to identify a person, a player, or a boy, right? Okay, now let's add defining relative clause to the boy, because we already know that a relative clause is a mini sentence that gives essential or additional information about a noun in a sentence. So now I'm going to add the small sentence relative clause to the boy. the boy who is standing next to the goalkeeper is my friend. Now we can understand which boy we are talking about or who we are talking about. We are talking about the boy that is standing next to the goalkeeper. Without this sentence, the listener won't understand which boy we mean. So this is a defining relative clause. It provides essential information, like a passport. It helps us identify which person or thing we're talking about. Okay? So again, if I skip this defining relative clause, can the listener understand which boy you mean? No, because there are many boys. So to make it clear to the listener who or what we are talking about, we use this defining relative clause. Okay? So every time you use a relative clause, ask yourself, is this information essential? If I remove it, will the listener still understand who or what I'm talking about? If the answer is no, then it's a defining relative clause. Okay? Now let's talk about non-defining relative clause. Non-defining relative clause. Think of them like a driving license or a bachelor's degree. This is extra information. Yes, we may need these documents, right? But they are additional information. We use them after we have already identified the person. So they are extra or additional information. So think of a non-defining relative clause like that, extra information. And again, you're watching football again and you say, my friend who is standing next to the goalkeeper is very good very good at football. Okay. My friend who's standing next to the goalkeeper is very good at football. Here I started the sentence with my friend. So most likely the listener already knows who I'm talking about. So most likely the listener already knows who I'm talking about. The friend is already identified. Who is standing next to the goalkeeper is just additional information. Even without this information, the listener understands. So even if I remove this information, it will be, my friend is very good at football. And it's very common with non-defining relative clauses to use words like my, your, her, his, etc. Or people's names, or this, that, these, those. They identify someone or something, these words. Like my father, my here identifies the person, or this book, it identifies the book. So when we start sentences with my, your, or this, that, we usually are using non-defining relative clauses, okay? Because these words already identify someone or something. So here we've got extra or additional information, not essential, because without this relative clause, the listener will still understand which person or thing we're talking about. That's a non-defining relative clause. Okay? My friend is very good at football. My friend. Okay? And we use commas with non-defining relative clauses. So it would be my friend, comma, who is standing next to the goalkeeper, comma, is very good, is very good at football. So we need 2 commas here. Even when speaking, we can notice the difference between defining and non-defining relative clauses, because when using non-defining relative clause when speaking, my friend, pause, my friend who is standing next to the goalkeeper, pause, is very good at football. Okay? So we don't just use commas like, randomly, but we pause here. My friend who is standing next to the goalkeeper, pause, is very good at football. Okay? So again, we usually use commas with non-defining relative clauses. Why? Because the information is extra or additional. The commas help us understand that the information is extra. It's not essential. So be careful with commas, okay? For example, if you don't know when to use commas, if you don't know whether we need commas with defining on or non-defining relative clauses, and say something like, for example, if you say, my husband who works in a bank, is 45 years old. Okay? My husband. So, as you can see, I started the sentence with my. It already means that the person is identified here. Okay? So, if I won't use commas here, that means I have more than one husband, maybe 2 of them, or 3 or 4 husbands, okay? And I'm talking about the one who works in a bank. One is a doctor, one is a lawyer, one is a pilot, and one works in a bank. Okay? Because without commas, we are identifying which one, okay? So if we skip the commas and say, my husband who works in a bank is 45 years old, we mean we have lots of husbands and we're identifying one that works in a bank. Okay? So be careful with commas, guys. Okay? However, if I add commas, my husband, pause, who works in a bank, pause, is 45 years old. This means I have one husband and I'm just giving you extra information about him who works in a bank. Even if I remove this part of the sentence still makes sense because husband is already identified, he's mine. Okay? Now, let me give you two examples, and I want you to tell me which one of them is defining relative clause, okay? The teacher who speaks English and the teacher Okay, can someone tell me which of these two sentences provides additional information? Which one of them is non-defining relative clause? Non-defining relative clause. Who speaks English without commas, right? It's a defining relative clause. The teacher who speaks English is kind. It's defining relative clause. Whereas with commas, we have non-defining relative clause. Now, what's the difference between these two sentences? Because both of them start with the words the teacher. Here, we identify which teacher we are talking about. Maybe there are lots of English teachers at school, okay? But we're talking, maybe there are lots of teachers at school, but we are talking about the one that speaks English, okay? We are identifying which one, the teacher. This information here is essential because there are lots of teachers, but the one who speaks English is kind. Okay? Whereas here, the teacher, when you see a comma, we already know that there is only one teacher we are talking about. We just add extra information who speaks English. Okay? Because the teacher, pause, who speaks English, pause is nice. The listener, So the teacher is kind is defining relative clause. Who speaks English? This sentence is defining relative clause. Who speaks English without commas? When we don't have commas, this is a defining relative clause, defining essential information, because there are lots of teachers, but the only one who speaks English is kind. Okay? We are identifying the teacher, which one of them. There are lots of teachers. Some of them speak French, German, Russian, but the one that speaks English is kind. Okay? Whereas if we use a comma, it becomes non-defining. Non-defining. This information is not important. The listener already knows who are you talking about, because maybe there is only one teacher. And yes, we can add extra information and say who speaks English. Okay, this information is extra information, additional information. Even without this information, the listener already knows who we are talking about. Whereas here, the listener doesn't know. And when we add who speaks English, then the listener understands the one that speaks English. Okay? So again, defining relative clause provides essential information to identify which person or thing we are talking about. Okay? Whereas non-defining relative clauses give us additional information or extra information, like a driving license or resume or maybe birth certificate, but they give us extra or additional information. The passport identifies. It helps us identify someone or something. It's essential. Without it, we cannot identify someone or something. Okay, this is essential. Whereas these, well, yeah, they are important, but they are extra, additional. We need them after the person or thing is already identified. If we cannot identify the person, we don't need these documents. They are useless. Okay? So think of the defining relative clause and non-defining relative clause like passports and like a driving license. This is essential, and these documents are extra. Okay? Now, we have an idea of the difference between defining and non-defining relative clauses, right? Now, let's go deeper and learn the relative words, like relative pronouns. You're very welcome, guys. Now let's go deeper and learn the relative words, such as relative pronouns, relative adverbs, that we use in defining relative clause. Because there are some detailed rules and structures that we use only with defining relative clauses. Because defining relative clauses and non-defining relative clauses, they sometimes have different rules, different structures. That's why it's better to first learn everything about defining relative clauses and then move on to the non-defining relative clauses. Okay? Again, we've got here the example when it comes to the defining relative clause, right? Because imagine you're at the shop and you're telling your friend the phone is a new model. So if I tell you the phone is a new model, can you guess which phone I mean? No, you can't, because there are 3 phones in the picture and the sentence gives no essential information. It doesn't provide defining relative clause. It doesn't provide passport. Okay? Now let's add passport to this sentence, to the phone. Let's add essential information. Let's add defining relative clause and say the phone that costs 1,500 is a new model. Here, this small sentence is a defining relative clause. It's a passport. It's essential information that identifies which phone we're talking about. The phone that costs 1,500 is a new model. Now you know which phone I mean. Okay? So let's go now step by step and learn each of the relative words, meaning relative pronouns that we use with defining relative clauses. Okay? With defining relative clauses. Just give me 2 seconds and I'll be back in 2 minutes, okay? Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. So, defining relative clause and the pronouns and adverbs we use with defining relative clauses, okay? And how we use them, the structure. Note that, guys, this is essential. We are talking about defining relative clause because the structures, the rules are different. Okay? Now we're learning defining relative clause and the relative words we use with defining relative clause. Because what is a defining relative clause? Essential information, a passport we use to identify someone or something. Okay? It's not extra information. It's not additional information. It's not a driving license or a resume or birth certificate. It's a passport. Defining relative clause. Okay? So, relative words, who or that. We can use both of them for people. Who is always used for people. However, we can replace who with that. Both are perfectly correct. So we can say, he's the man who fixed my phone. And we can say, he's the man that fixed my phone. Both are correct. Or the students who study every day succeed. The students that study every day succeed. We can use both who and that. That is commonly used in spoken English, whereas in formal speech, in writing, we usually use who or even whom. We'll talk about whom later. For example, he's the man that fixed my phone, informal. Or the students that study every day succeed, informal. Okay? So, in defining relative clause, we can use who and that for people. So again, he is the man who fixed my phone. Here, we add essential information, who fixed my phone. This information is essential. Because if we only say, he's the man, it doesn't make sense, right? Which man? Who are you talking about? The listener won't understand which man you mean. So we need a passport, essential information here. Or the students who study every day succeed. Who study every day. This information is essential here. Okay? And we've got whom, as I've mentioned previously. Whom, it's formal, rarely used in speaking, in informal speaking, okay? However, it's perfectly correct and we can still use it, especially in formal situations. And it works like the object of the sentence. Like here, for example, I lent money to John. Here, John receives the action. Yesterday, we talked about the objects, right? Like, where is it? Muhammad is reading a book. Here, book is the object of the sentence. Why? Because it receives the action. Something is done to the book, so it's an object of the sentence. So, when we have the object in a sentence and we want to add essential information to the object, we use whom. Okay? And we say, the man whom I lent money to doesn't want to give it back. Or the students whom she invited came early. So here, students received the action, right? She here is the main person. She invited the students. But we are not talking about she, we are talking about the students. So the students whom she invited came early. However, again, we use whom in formal situation, in writing, etc. Even here, we can use who or that. And instead of saying the students whom she invited came early, we can say the students who she invited came early. So even if you are talking about the object of the sentence, and even if you are talking about someone that receives the action, you can still use who or that. Okay? So here we can say the students who she invited came early. So here, instead of whom, I've used who. And it's more common nowadays using who instead of whom. The students who she invited came early. Or, even more casual, we can say the students that she invited, came early. That she invited. We've got defining relative clause, but we have changed whom to that. So again, we can use who or that instead of whom, even if we are talking about the subject of the sentence, because here the students, this word is the subject of the sentence, the receiver of the action, right? They were invited. They received the action. So again, we can use whom, who, or that. They are all perfectly correct when we are talking about people, okay? Not animals, not things. When we talk about people, we can use whom, who, that. Okay? Okay, let's... Exactly, the students whom she invited came early. Exactly. Or we can just say without whom. Instead of whom, we can use who or that. The students who she invited came early, or the students that she invited came early. They are all correct. However, guys, note that we are talking about